Okay, so let's look at the poem in more detail and go back to the idea of the persona and the audience. So, the first person persona in the poem deserves consideration. Reading a little bit of information about the collection the Wild Iris, we can learn that each poem embodies a voice from one side of another in conversations between personified flowers in a garden and the gardener poet, and the presence of an unnamed deity or god. So I think we can safely say, as well as from the content of the poem, that the I in the poem, do you know what I was, how I lived? I did not expect to survive, earth suppressing me. We can presume that the I is the personification of the snowdrop. However, without being rigid and saying that that is the only interpretation, you see that later in the poem, there in the center of the octave, she says, I didn't expect to waken again, to feel in damp earth my body able to respond again. And that use of body in reference even to a personified flower is a little bit strange. It catches the attention. And it makes you think that this idea of personification is fluid, and it could be more that the flower is a representation or an externalization of a human experience. So it remains fluid, it remains ambivalent. Just the same with the audience. Now, the audience is even more intriguing in a sense. Because for me, at the beginning of the poem, when I read the tercet, do you know what I was? You know what despair is. I was thinking of a one-to-one conversation, the conversation between the flower and another entity, a single entity. But then, towards the end of the poem, we have afraid, yes, but among you again. Among is a word which infers that that you, of course, must be plural. So does the you of the audience change from the beginning to the end of the poem? Is it fluid? Is it ambivalent, like the persona I? Questions all worth asking. I also discovered, reading a little bit about Gluck's poetry, that I knew that in the collection The Wild Iris there is the presence of a deity, referred to in the articles I read as an unnamed deity. But I also found out that she favors certain deities or goddesses in many of her poems. Dido is present, Eurydice is present, but also Persephone. Persephone is an important presence in Gluck's poetry. Now, it seemed to me that the idea of Persephone and her story, which is so closely linked with the changing of the seasons, could well be a useful interpretation of the you, especially when we're referring to the singular you at the beginning of the poem. Persephone's story, I'll just click onto that for a second. Persephone's story, which represents, as we said, which gives an explanation for winter, in contrast with the other three seasons on Earth. Since Persephone was abducted by the king of the underworld, Hades, and taken into the underworld to that realm of death. And her grieving mother, Demeter, causes the earth to become a barren and sterile place as an expression of her grief at the abduction and the violence against her daughter. She manages eventually to persuade Zeus to allow Persephone to return to the world above. But Hades tricks Persephone into eating pomegranate seeds, and these seeds will mean that she will be obliged to return periodically to the underworld and to Hades, until he has to again release her to go back to her mother. So the pomegranate seeds create a cycle of returning to death, and then the return to life, the return to despair, and then the return to joy, this continual cycle. And it seemed to me that this fitted in beautifully with what was happening in the poem. If we have a look back here, that if the snowdrop is saying, you know what despair is, that makes sense. If the you is Persephone, the deity who has suffered the violence of abduction. And winter should have meaning for you. The cycle of the seasons, the grief of her mother, and also the idea of the snowdrop being underneath the earth and Persephone being taken under the earth into the underworld, and the idea that when Persephone can reappear or return to the earth's surface, then spring, the beginning of a new life on the surface of the planet, just ties in perfectly. So here we're thinking about an audience which could well be, at certain moments in the story, Persephone. Her presence, I can feel her presence quite strongly, but it could be, as we said before, an address between a human to a human, the flower to the gardener, the flower to Persephone, the flower to the other flowers or the other elements which dwell above the earth. This idea of but among you again, in fact, is probably best explained by the idea of the flower coming back to the surface to be among the other things which dwell on the surface and not below the earth. So we're already seeing a reading of the poem which is full of ambivalence, but intriguing, interesting, exactly for that reason. So moving on to the narrative of the poem, the story it's telling, we saw quite clearly in the first reading that it is a poem about despair, trauma, and the idea of overcoming, surviving, healing perhaps. And if you look first of all at the words which have been highlighted in blue, here we have the idea of despair at the beginning of the poem, linked to the idea of winter. And then towards the end of the poem, the idea of spring, which has been linked to the word joy. So from winter to spring, from despair to joy. So that idea of surviving, healing, renewal is certainly clear as it was in the first reading. Let's have a look at some other aspects. Look at the beginning of the poem and the parts that I've underlined. Can you see how this initial tercet moves from a kind of uncertainty, the question, do you know what I was, how I lived? A question which remains unanswered. It's kind of a question into silence, because although that audience is present, the audience does not respond in any way. And here we're feeling the isolation of the persona, the kind of isolation which is typical of the confessional poetry, which is said to have inspired Glck in some way, for example, the work of Robert Lowell. And so we have uncertainty, followed immediately by a kind of affirmation of certainty. You know what despair is. You know. Do you know? You know what despair is. But then she moves back again to uncertainty. Winter should have meaning. You should know. So we've got uncertainty to certainty to uncertainty. And that idea that uncertainty needs to be dispelled, but if uncertainty remains, it can be embraced, I think is important. Then let's move on to the word survive. This word dominates the idea of the octave, this central part of the poem. Survival. What has the flower survived? Earth suppressing me. I talked before about the careful choice of words that Glck makes, and this word suppress is amazing because it not only means keep down, this idea of pressure on top of you, under the earth, the flower, the bulbs under the earth, but it also has the idea of kept quiet. So not only am I being kept down physically, I'm also being kept quiet verbally, the lost voice. Glck speaks of the idea of consciousness buried in dark earth, and then the idea of survival and how that is associated with finding a voice again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. Look how that is taken up in the definition of survive, how the act of survival takes place. Follow the words that are highlighted now in yellow. To survive, I need to wake up, that is return to consciousness, respond, find my voice, remember, have a past. Having a past, having a history means being able to be present in the present and to move towards a future. And then finally, open. Open, an expression of candidness, of vulnerability, opening up, allowing yourself to be vulnerable. So return to consciousness, finding a voice, remembering the past, opening yourself up to vulnerability. That's what healing is all about, that kind of process. Now let's have a look at the words again. I've highlighted that in grey, and you can see waken again, respond again, open again, among you again, 4 times, a deliberate repetition to underline the fact that surviving and healing, just as trauma and despair, are things which do not happen in a void or a single time. They are things which happen again and again. And this incredible ability to face despair and to heal, which occurs in cycles, leading us back to thinking about Persephone and the fact that her trauma is a continual circle of trauma, or linked to the cycles of nature. So circles and cycles, returning, reoccurring, absolutely fascinating. And then looking at the context in which this snowdrop awakes, have a look at the words which I've highlighted in dark green. The environment in which the snowdrop begins to come back to life, we've associated with the idea of joy and spring. But if we have a closer look at that environment, it's described as damp earth, cold light, raw wind, elements which obviously express a kind of hostile environment, hostile, cruel. The kind of spring we're talking about here is not the sweet spring of Chaucer's sweet April showers. It's much more like the cruel month we would find in Eliot's Wasteland. In fact, a kind of wasteland, the new world with its raw wind and cold light and damp earth. The last thing I wanted to show in the narrative is the note of optimism, which is brought in by the repetition of yes. Here at the end of the poem, afraid yes, crying yes, a repetition of yes, which also made me think of the repetition of yes in Molly's monologue at the end of Joyce's Ulysses. This affirmation, this positive affirmation of yes, yes. But look how typical of the ambivalence of Glck in this poem, that the idea of yes is associated with the idea of risk. We're talking about joy, we're talking about positive affirmation, but in the midst of that there is risk, there is danger, because it happens again. Trauma will happen again, despair will happen again, but it's worth it. It's worth taking the risk and being able to find your way out. That touch of danger there is an amazing little element in between those two positive words. I'm moving on to language and tone. I've heard that Gluck's poetry is sometimes referred to as colloquial. I'm definitely seeing in the language of the poem, the tone of the poem, I'm seeing a conversation. Do you know what I was? We enter into a conversation, but it is not a conversation which has the feeling, the taste of informality or a casual language. It has a certain formality within the conversation. The language, because it is so carefully chosen, the words are loaded, the words are selected. It maintains a feeling of austerity, of a certain formality, which I don't think, I could not personally refer to as colloquial. Let me give you an example. A sentence like, or a phrase like, then winter should have meaning for you. She doesn't say, you should know what winter means. The difference in the phrasing gives a difference in texture and register, just as it would in Italian if you say dovresti sapere cosa vuol dire inverno, or in contrast with inverno dovrebbe avere un significato per te. It feels different, doesn't it? It feels different in your mouth. It's not that casual conversation. It's a conversation in words which have been carefully chosen and which are layered with meaning. Words like suppress, with that idea of kept down and kept quiet, which the layers of meaning which are compressed into few and scarce words. There's a beautiful use of juxtaposition too, with a word like light, which is you associate with warmth and brightness, associated with the word cold. The idea of newness in the world on the last line there, the new world, a positive word, a word which speaks of freshness, of new beginnings. And then another word, raw, which in reference to the wind means cold, cruel, sharp, but also has the idea of newness, greenness, inexperience. A very raw person is a person, who is very green, who is inexperienced. So it takes up the idea of newness and turns it into something much more cruel, more negative. So that's another powerful juxtaposition. And as we mentioned before, that juxtaposition between the idea of joy and the positive effect of the word yes, and the word risk, which is placed in the middle. I just wanted to also draw your attention to punctuation. So at the beginning, the unanswered question. The tercet finishes with a full stop. And then at the beginning of the octave, we have another full stop, which ends the introduction to the idea of survival. From then on, the poem is in a single sentence right to the end. And we will see how, when we're talking about the musicality, we'll see how the enjambment draws us on to the end of the poem inevitably, as does the lack of punctuation or the lack of final stopping punctuation until right till the end of the poem. Right from this line here, I didn't expect, right to the end of the poem, New World. But also look at the part of the poem that I've highlighted in blue. So the first of those two lines says, afraid, yes, but among you again. The commas create pauses, hesitations, so that the word yes can be a confirmation of the idea of being afraid. Afraid, yes. The second line has the same idea, a word followed by the word yes. But Glck has chosen not to put any punctuation in that line. So the meaning or the power of that line changes according to how you read it, how you punctuate it yourself. Let me give you two examples. If I read it like the first line, crying, yes. Crying has one meaning. Whereas if I read it with this punctuation, crying, yes, risk joy, it has another meaning. So is it weeping, crying? Yes. Or is it shouting out, crying, yes, risk joy? The fact that the punctuation isn't there, it means it's up to you, and perhaps it's both. And the blank spaces on the page, I think white spaces are always very important, but you can see here how she uses blank spaces on the page to highlight and to isolate certain lines. Here, a single phrase becomes isolated on the page in the raw wind of the new world. Those blank spaces creating stanzas is also very typical of vowel. So, going on now to the idea of musicality. We did say at the beginning of the talk, or the beginning of the presentation, that there was definitely musicality here, and that the natural rhythms of spoken language, which create a certain musicality, do you know what I was, how I lived? Natural musicality is being enhanced, and I found that it was certainly being enhanced by repetition. Repetition inside a poem creates an intensity and musicality, and Glck certainly chooses certain parts of the poem to create this intensity. So at the beginning, have a look at the words in blue again. At the beginning of the poem, do you know? You know, playing on that idea of certainty and uncertainty, the idea of knowing and not knowing. And then at the beginning of the octave, I didn't expect the idea of surprise, disbelief, the ability to survive, trauma again. Then the repetition of again that we mentioned before, which underlines the cyclic nature of trauma, the cyclic nature of healing, and calls to mind the idea of the cycles of nature and of the myth of Persephone. And the repetition of yes, which we said had that Joycean effect of positive affirmation, but then coupled with the word risk. There is also some beautiful repetition of sounds. Have a look at the words that the letters, the sounds that I've highlighted in yellow. At the beginning of the poem, the idea of winter, with the w of winter, is captured in the repetition of the w sound in the first 3 lines. Do you know what I was, how I lived? You know what despair is, then winter should have meaning for you. So the w of winter gives us the repetition of the w sounds at the beginning of the poem, when we're still talking about despair. And can you see how even the w sounds at the end of a word like how survives because of the liaison with the I that follows it? How, why, how, why. So a powerful presence of the w sound, which is then supplanted at the beginning of the octave when she begins to talk about survival and spring. The s of spring coming out in expect, survive, suppressing, expect, respond, so long, earliest spring. There's a kind of cohesion which is created by the repetition of these sounds in the 2 different parts of the poem. What happens at the end? Last line, look what happens at the end. In the raw wind of the new world, the w sound returns. And so we've got the idea again of the cycle, the inescapability, the return to winter, that winter will come again, trauma will come again, despair will come again. I mentioned before the enjambment, pulling us on to the end of the poem. I think that is the power of the enjambment here, that especially since there is also that lack of punctuation from fairly early on in the poem right to the end, we are drawn on in the narrative to its conclusion. So a brief look at the context, which once again opens up a series of questions rather than gives any particular answers, but which also opens up then to the possibility of exploration and of personal interpretation. You can find out about Glck that she does at times also write poems which have a certain political or social commentary. Although it's clear that her poems are highly personal, in a poem like October, which was written after the violence and destruction of 9/11 and the American presence in Afghanistan, the idea of nature and trauma, nature and violence, could have a more political or social interpretation. There's a short quotation here from the poem October. Summer after summer has ended, balm after violence. It does me no good to be good to me now. Violence has changed me. Of course, it could be a very personal comment. It could be a comment on the violence and the terrorism which characterized the early years of the 2000s. So is it possible that the poem Snowdrops is talking about a big issue? Is it a poem of social comment about trauma and despair and recovery on a national or a political or a social level? Also, looking at Glück's descent, she's a poet of Jewish descent. If she's talking about cycles of trauma, certainly the Jewish people have suffered cycles of trauma throughout history. Could it be a comment on that? Glück is obviously a female poet, And we saw through the figure of Persephone how strong that idea of mother-daughter, violence, abduction, grief, was strongly feminine, strongly female. So a woman speaking to and about women. And you can see all of these things are questions I'm asking rather than answers I'm giving. Because part of the reading I managed to do on Glck also gave me the idea that her poems, although there might be these large, these greater, these more universal interpretations, it always remains a very personal poetry which has been considered at times very close to the confessional poets, although not strictly in line with their style, but certainly autobiographical and certainly about the individual. In fact, Glick's publisher, who should know her poems pretty well, says of them, and that's the second quotation on this page, she's a clarifying poet. There doesn't seem to be much political engagement in her poems. They're really about the individual human being alive in the world. So the individual, helping us explore the world as individuals, and with that perhaps autobiographical note. Glück herself talks about poetry as an art of inward listening, and she here refers to Keats as her inspiration, that ability to listen inwardly and then to express that inward listening on the page. So let's have a look on a more personal note about the kind of cycles or repeated or numerous traumas that she has suffered and survived. Anorexia in her late teens, 2 divorces, the loss of her father, and a major house fire as well, which was a particularly traumatic experience. There is obviously here plenty of subject, plenty of meat, plenty of content for poems about despair and loss and trauma. But I think perhaps the most interesting is what happened after her late teens, when she was overcoming anorexia, was that she went into a long period of therapy, psychoanalytic psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and she I think that has fed back into her poetry in a very important way. If you think about the idea, when we talked about healing in the poem Snowdrops, how the idea of being able to be uncertain, the idea of being able to be open and to be vulnerable, the ability to distance yourself from the trauma, to look at it, to examine it, how present those those therapeutic notes were in the poem Snowdrops. But having listed all these things, I can also say, could the poem be about all of the above or none of the above? And the beautiful thing is that the poem can be about none of the above, and it can be a poem which you use to reflect on a personal moment of despair and of overcoming despair. So the ambivalence is something which allows a great freedom of interpretation and a great freedom to see oneself in the poem. So to draw some very brief conclusions, if we consider the poem now with all the ideas of trauma, suffering, despair, the idea of survival and healing, that healing is associated with being able to be vulnerable, being able to accept uncertainty, that trauma is something which is repeated, just as healing is something which is a repeated act, the idea of circles and cycles, the interlacing of the myth, perhaps, of Persephone, and all that has brought in terms of layers of meaning to the poem, the personal and intimate nature of the poem, with at the same time its austerity and distance. And then we think about how Glück has created persona and audience, how she has formed a deep and complex and ambivalent narrative, how she's given it a non-traditional form, but with an enormous care in the choice of form and language, musicality and ambivalent context. And then, if I'm allowed to repeat perhaps the quotation that I found most relevant to this particular poem, whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. And if we bear all that in mind and allow these things to colour our final reading of the poem, I'd like to read it one more time before we say goodbye. Snowdrops. Do you know what I was? How I lived? You know what despair is. Then winter should have meaning for you. I didn't expect to survive, earth suppressing me. I didn't expect to waken again, to feel in damp earth my body able to respond again, remembering after so long how to open again in the cold light of earliest spring. Afraid? Yes, but among you again, crying, yes, risk joy, in the raw wind of the new world.